platform on civic engagement, states' rights, and jobs.
This week on Q&A, Wall Street Journal staff reporter and columnist Alexandra Wolfe. She discusses her book, Valley of the Gods, a Silicon Valley story.
Alexandra Wolfe, what is the Valley of the Gods?
Valley of the Gods is this book about these three. It focuses on three fellows who won this Peter Thiel Fellowship, and so it looks through the eyes of these three kids, and it shows sort of the cultural anthropology of Silicon Valley right now, and hopefully a few other alternatives to going to college.
So why did you do this?
Well, why did I do it to begin with? I mean, I've always grown up in New York. I've always lived in New York, and I went out to Silicon Valley for the first time a couple years ago, and I was so amazed by what I saw there. I was so refreshed by the optimism, and I mean, reading the paper, they're changing every single industry, and being there, I just found way more than I ever thought I would see on the East Coast. It was so different.
You lead off with the author's note. First thing you say is, I first met Peter Thiel, the co-founder of PayPal, managing partner of Founders Fund, and first investor in Facebook in New York, at a salon at his house in 2006.
Yeah.
Go back to the salon, and who was Peter Thiel and why were you there?
So I met him through some friends of my parents, and he, at that point in New York, nobody really knew who he was. And he was really famous on the West Coast for founding PayPal, and he'd been the first. And so I go to this salon, and these friends said, oh, you might find him interesting. He could be an interesting subject. And I got there, and he had these people presenting at his house, and they all were saying things that were completely counterintuitive. So, and if they said it out loud at their job, they would have gotten fired. So it was all these sort of politically incorrect things or contrarian ideas, and they would get up and present. And it was really the only forum where they could do it. And I thought this was so fascinating that this guy knew all of these people who were saying things which at the time sounded crazy. But some of them turned out to be right. He was talking about, he predicted the real estate bubble. So back in 2006, he's saying, oh, this is going to crash. And everybody's saying, well, my apartment just, appreciated by millions of dollars. So what are you talking about? But some of his predictions came true. So it was really interesting.
New York is where you grew up. Where'd you go to college?
Duke University.
Why'd you pick that spot?
My father's family was from down there, and so I was comfortable with it. But also, it was totally different than this sort of the New England Ivy League schools. And I applied there early, and I just thought it was so. I just thought it was fun to be in a different part of the country.
If you look closely, our audience can pick out a face that looks familiar when you talk about your father. Who is your father?
Well, he wears a different color than I do. His name is Tom Wolfe, and he wears a white suit. And he wrote Bonfire of the Vanities and The Right Stuff. And what else did he write? A couple other books. Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test.
Yes, and speaking of electric cool acid test, I want to show you some video of Ken Kesey.
Oh, great.
Because I get a sense, you mentioned him in his book, in your book, and I get a sense that what you found in Silicon Valley has some connection to this.
It really does.
Let's watch a little bit of this.
Okay.
Go ahead, would you repeat that again?
We weren't old enough to be beatniks, and we were a little too old to be hippies. Everybody I knew had read On the Road. It stirred us up. So we decided to go travel across the country.
Since it turned out that there were so many of us, we decided we'd buy a bus.
It was like a troupe of minstrels.
There was this guy with no shirt on, talking a mile a minute.
Cassidy is going to drive the bus. It looked like a traveling pleasure palace. It was big and roomy and spacious, until we got all the people in it.
Yes, that's it, Commander, as usual.
We take turns riding shotgun with him.
It was almost impossible for him to ever shut off.
All you can do is experience this thing.
Ken really believed that things could be changed. He saw himself as a kind of liberator.
People didn't think we were hippies or that we were drug freaks because it wasn't in the news yet.
The public always grinned when they saw that bus.
We are the Merry Band of Pranksters.
I'm flying down the 3rd Street, wrapped in mother's wine and cheap-ass best.
Once Pandora's box is open, you can't regulate who gets to use the stuff that flies out of it. I thought this was as American as you could get because we were exploring a new territory.
That was from a documentary. A lot of things I want to ask you about. First, when did you read your father's book, Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test?
Probably a couple of years ago, and it was strangely relevant to this book because this book originally was supposed to be a bus trip that was a reverse of the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. So Peter Thiel and the foundation that works for him, they were going to rent out the opposite of Ken Kesey's 1939 Harvester school bus that we just saw and outfit it to be this high-tech dorm. And they went to Tennessee and they found Justin Bieber's old tour bus. And they were going to have it all decorated in sort of with computers and electronics and this and that. And they ended up canceling the bus trip 2 weeks before. But it was completely based on that whole...
Were you going to go on that bus trip?
Yeah, I was going to go. It was going to be a month. We were going to stop at colleges along the way. And it was going to go from New York to Palo Alto instead of Palo Alto to the East Coast. And it was supposed to be a rejection of all of the things that institutions on the East Coast had done that were Timothy Leary from the from Ken Kesey's circle became a professor. And then this new version of the bus was going to take all these kids away from the professors that were, said things that they disagreed with.
What would, in your opinion, be the difference in the politics of the Ken Kesey crowd versus the crowd that you got to know out there?
Well, in a weird way, they wouldn't be even that different because, I mean, if you were to say Ken Kesey, I mean, now a lot of the people I met out there were libertarian. It actually, in a strange way, wasn't all that different. Their behavior was definitely different. It was a completely different kind of drug. The drug was, massive internet success versus acid. But a lot of the similarities, I mean, I remember I asked my father, I told him that I was writing this book, and he said, oh yeah, I wrote about that in 1983. It was this story about Robert Noyce, and it was called The Tinkerings of Robert Noyce, one of the Intel founders. And a lot of things were so similar, just the way everybody dressed and these co-living communes. And I thought, Dad, you scooped me. But well, he did in a lot of ways. But for that story particularly, he sort of wrote about that first. That people didn't wear a necktie out there. That everything was really casual.
Well, when you were out there hanging around them, Did you wear a hoodie?
I have a lot more hoodies now than I did in 2011.
What is the hoodie business?
Oh, I think it's an imitation of Mark Zuckerberg. I kind of think a lot of entrepreneurs that go out there and they want to be a founder of a company, they think that venture capitalists will fund them if they look like successful entrepreneurs. And so I kind of feel like weirdly Mark Zuckerberg started this whole fashion craze. No one would ever accuse him of being particularly fashionable, but now everybody has a hoodie. And actually my father was telling me this funny story that he went out to interview someone about hedge funds and digital technology, and he said that one of these companies was saying that it was so weird when a Wall Street banker came out there to try to, I think they were going to try to undo the IPO of one of the big tech companies, and he came in he was 75 years old and came in wearing a hoodie and sneakers, and everybody just laughed because they'd seen him in a suit all the time, and he's an investment banker. But it really seems to have spread. I mean, if I went into a company out there looking like this, they'd think that I was going to the prom. So, I mean, nobody wears a dress or skirts or anything like that.
Well, speaking of dress, here is your father when he was here, and this is one of the most memorable moments. He won't like this. Well, maybe you will. Let's watch.
Okay.
Articles would say, "What an interesting man. He wears white suits." So it took the place of a personality for many years.
How many of them do you have?
I used to have a lot of them. I've got about 22 now. I can get by with that.
How long can you wear them without having to have them cleaned?
About 6 hours. When you to go on a trip and make people think you have one, you have to have three. And I have 3 suits I brought along to come here, all made of the same material. You can't really tell the difference, but it really it simply has not hurt to have a trademark.
That's really funny.
What have you learned from your father about writing?
Well, I wish I could come up with the equivalent of a white suit. But it's funny, I asked him, because I'm a reporter. I'm so used to asking questions that I'm not really, I'm so not used to answering them. So I asked my dad at the beginning when this book came out, I said, "How do you answer questions?" And he said, "Well, I just wore a white suit. Then I didn't have to. No matter what I said, I was interesting because I had the white suit on." And I said, "Well, I can't really wear a white suit, I guess." And he said, "You'll be fine."
But everybody knows about the white suits.
Yeah.
The fact that was interesting was the 22 of them.
Right.
Does he wear them around the house
have more than that.
In New York when he's there? Does he wear them every day?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, he has some variations. He has this really nice smoking jacket that sometimes he'll put over the white suit. If he goes to the doctor, if he goes to shopping, definitely a white suit. He goes to the gym every day though, and he doesn't wear white to the gym. He wears navy to the gym. He has a white guayabera. I mean, he's pretty inventive. So.
Go back to the West Coast, and one of the things I picked up in your book is there is a huge difference between the East Coast and the West Coast. I did happen to think, because I'm from the Midwest, and you left out the rest of the country. But what is this difference? What is this difference between East and West?
Well, I feel like the biggest difference is actually in the status systems. On the East Coast, you have it's vertical. It's a hierarchy, and you pay your dues, and then you get to the next level, traditionally speaking. And then on the West Coast, it's so much more horizontal. So to get in with the group are these networks. And so you sort of laterally move into a certain network. And it doesn't really matter how old you are, or, as long as you're wearing a hoodie. But you could be old or young or anything, or you just have to be sort of connected and have the same status values in a way. For example, in the book, a lot of these kids who went out there to try to be the gods of Silicon Valley, like Elon Musk or Peter Thiel, would copy their idiosyncrasies instead of copying their brilliance, because that was much harder. And so they would take on these interests in living forever, or becoming paleo, or the seasteading, the institute, which is these libertarian colonies in the ocean that Patrick Friedman came up with, who's the son of, or the grandson of Milton Friedman. And so it was sort of by interest that people grouped together. Whereas in New York, where I grew up, it felt like it was, you go to this kind of college, you get this kind of job, you climb the ladder. So that was a really big distinction that I saw out there.
What does it mean, going paleo?
Oh, you can't have any carbs, or you can't have any refined carbs, no sugar. Everything has to be natural, things that a Paleolithic caveman would have eaten.
All right, you talked about Milton Friedman. We've got some video I want to show. The first thing folks are going to see is the grandfather, his son, and his son, who you write about. Let's watch this.
Okay. Wherever you have had an improvement in the conditions of the ordinary people over any lengthy time, it's been in a capitalist society. And yet, everybody is extending socialism.
I think one should have a society without government. That I think in the short run, there are some things government does that it should stop doing tomorrow, and some that will take some years to replace.
We've talked about the nature of the ocean today. It's a unique place. It's a dynamic medium that mixes things, that allows movement, and that makes it perfect for societal evolution.
Why is Patry, the grandson of Milton Friedman and the son of David Friedman, in your book?
Well, because Peter Thiel funded these islands that he wanted to build out in the ocean, and it's called the Seasteading Institute. And
Seasteading.
Seasteading, yes. And so after, I think it's outside of 12 miles away from shore, then you're outside of U.S. jurisdiction. And so the idea was to have these floating islands where you could create your own government there. And so they had all these models for it, and each one cost $500,000. And Peter Thiel gave him $500,000. I don't know if it would be an investment technically, but gave him $500,000. I think because he thought it was such a unique idea. And so that's how Patry Friedman met Peter Thiel, and then he helped out with this fellowship, this 20 under 20 program that the main characters in the book were part of, and he helped look at the applications, and he was there at the beginning, mentoring some of them.
What would be the difference between Patry Friedman and, say, his grandfather in lifestyle?
Oh, well, Patry Friedman used to have this polyamorous lifestyle. He lived in this commune in Mountain View called Tortuga, and now he's actually monogamous and engaged to a nice woman, and they have the same. They have one relationship. But before, he had a co-parent, and then they had roommates, and they all sort of lived as one big happy family. And Patry also is much less establishment, clearly, than his grandfather. I mean, his ideas were really out of the box. I mean, they were less just pure economics and more to me, I had never heard anything like it before. I just thought his point of view was really, really refreshing and new. And he's such an odd character. I mean, I remember I think one of the first times I met him was on this cruise ship with all these tech entrepreneurs, and he's wearing a Burger King crown and this purple cape, and he's running around with those Fives sneakers that he just looked like somebody from a different planet. So he made for a good book character.
What would his politics be, and how much would he agree or disagree with his grandfather?
Oh, I mean, I think in a way there's the thread that unites them. I mean, he's extremely libertarian. I mean, I think he actually has deals to work with countries to actually start entirely new governments. And he and his friend James Hogan, they worked on this. It was this experimental pre-version of seasteading called Ephemerile. And you'd go up, and there's this lake, and everybody would bring these rafts, and they'd experiment in all sorts of government styles. And I can't imagine that Milton Friedman actually did that. So he seemed like he actually tried these things and lives this way, which was interesting to write about.
Now, you work at the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah.
How often do you write? Where can people see what you do?
Oh, twice a week. So I have one column about art, and then I have another column, which is a profile of a different person every week, called Weekend Confidential.
That's the art section.
Yeah, the review. So yeah, one of the weekend sections. Yeah, exactly.
You did a profile recently on your father.
Yes.
What was that like?
Oh, it was so intimidating, because it was sort of. I mean, I wanted to try to do it justice and try to do it in his own style, which was even harder. So I had all these, I put all these expectations on myself. But my father's so agreeable, so he made it a lot better. But I think I started it out. An early draft was going, "Dad," because he starts out so many of his articles with so many exclamation points, and I also, he had just written a book that I think was pretty controversial. But it was weird. I mean, he was very accessible, so that was helpful in getting the interview.
What was the impact that both your father and your mother had on you? And you have a brother, Tommy.
Yeah, brother Tommy.
What's he like, and what's he do?
Oh, he's this great artist. He's he makes furniture, and he builds sculptures, and he makes jewelry and things like that. And he lives in Brooklyn with his wife. He and my father are probably the most moral and my mother. I shouldn't say that, Mom, if you're watching. No, but they're the most moral people. He's one of those people who they're very principled. There's no gray area. There's right and there's wrong, and I always respected that about him.
But he's gone over the years into some strange environments.
Yeah.
As have you?
Right. Yes. I mean, that, I think the other thing about that is that when he goes into these strange environments, he looks even stranger because he doesn't try to adapt to them. So I always thought that was so interesting because, I asked him when he was reporting the book, before, the electrocoolate acid test, what he wore. And he said, I wore a suit and a tie. And, I carried a notebook. And I think that's what he's done for every single book. I mean, or just in life, he's never tried to fit in. And I like going into situations that are uncomfortable reporting, but I always think about him because I have that human reaction of thinking, oh, do I fit in? What are they going to think? But then he always reminds me, you don't have to fit in. You're just a fly on the wall. You're just reporting the scene. Like, who cares what they think? And so there have been so many reporting trips where I've gone on where I don't feel like I fit in. And one I remember I went to Malawi with this Gucci fashion group, and I felt so out of place. And I just remember my father's voice saying, "You don't have to dress like you're, in the Gucci PR department. You're writing about them." So that's really been helpful. And then, even about Silicon Valley, my father was out there, I think, reporting I Am Charlotte Simmons, but he was staying at a hotel near Stanford. And he doesn't try to look like a professor even. So he's wearing this really nice suit and he has a tie on. And he said he was leaving his hotel restaurant and somebody stopped him on the way out and tried to give him a tip because they thought he was a waiter. And so it's sort of these things that happen, and he just gets a kick out of it. So it's sort of I definitely try to think about that if I'm reporting on somewhere.
Did you read I'm Charlotte Simmons?
I did, yes. And I have a T-shirt that says I am not Charlotte Simmons because everybody said, "Oh, it's so much like Duke. Oh, it's so much like your life." And the plot, thank goodness, was not my life, but some of her characteristics I could understand. And so yes, I have my T-shirt that I.
When he does something like that, does he talk to you about that book before it comes out?
Yeah, we did talk about it because I was in college when he was writing. He talked to my brother and I. We both. He came to Chapel Hill to do some of the reporting because I refused to let him come to Duke. And I remember calling him one morning for breakfast. I said, "Dad, it's 10. Are you ready for breakfast?" And he's like, "Oh, I'm so tired. I was at a frat party till 3 a.m. last night. Can we just do it a little later?" And so I did hear a lot about it. But yeah, no, I had the same boyfriend all through college. And in this book, this woman dates about 20 people or something. So I feel like I always have to have this disclaimer: I'm not Charlotte Simmons. But it was really fun hearing my father's take on all of these people. And he gave, sorry, I'm going on too long, but he gave our graduation talk, and it became part of this essay he wrote, Hooking Up. And it was so embarrassing because it's in front of my entire college class, and I just wanted to put a bag over my head because he said, the whole courtship rituals have changed completely. You meet somebody, and then you eyes lock, lips lock, hips lock, and then the next morning you say, "What's your name?" And everybody in the whole student body looks at me like, what did you tell him? So, yeah.
So back to this book. There was a quote that I wanted to read back to you from a man named John Burnham.
Oh, yeah.
It's relevant to what we do in this town. He says, John, and I'll show you a clip in a minute. Take democracy for one. Why, he wondered, did everyone believe in it so blindly? Instead, John thought democracy was really oligarchy, government by a select few. He borrowed this idea from Moldberg's blog, then looked for the same concept in Plato. Plato is magnificent, he said, matter-of-factly. Do they really believe that democracy is a bad idea?
I think some of them do. John Burnham was the most precocious boy I'd ever met. He had read everything. He wasn't necessarily a bad student, but he was so badly behaved because he was so ahead of the game. He had read, the school reading in 11th and 12th grade was so boring to him that he just read these blogs and he read philosophy all day. But I think actually he didn't get involved in politics, but he was so interested in those ideas, and he applied to the fellowship with that idea.
We have to stop and talk about Peter Thiel for a moment and the fellowship before we show you John Burnham. Yeah. Who is Peter Thiel today, and how does he factor in this? You say you met him 10 years ago in the salon. So today,
the lens that I really view him through in this book is through his fellowship to convince these students to drop out of college. But today he's gotten a lot of attention lately, obviously, for supporting Trump's presidency. But he's an investor, and he still makes a lot of angel. He works for a founder. He was a partner at Founders Fund, a venture capital firm in San Francisco, and he's sort of known as this godfather of the PayPal mafia, and these people who he worked at PayPal with and have gone on to create huge companies, such as Jeremy Stoppelman of Yelp, and then
how old is he?
Oh, he's in his late 40s. So.
And how much is he worth?
Oh, probably about $2 billion.
Let's watch a little bit of Peter Thiel so we can see what he looks like and sounds like.
I've been a big critic of the U.S. education system, focus a lot on higher education, where you have this runaway student debt. We now have over $1 trillion of student debt. I think we have a bubble in higher education. And I think that it is, I do not think that it is actually helping people do more entrepreneurial or more risk-taking things. When you graduate from college with $100,000 of debt, you will take a safe, reasonably well-paying job to pay off your debt, and you will be much less likely to do something entrepreneurial or creative or artistic, which may pay less but ultimately create more value.
When did he create this fellowship? How many are involved in it? How old are they? The story behind the Thiel Fellows.
So he started in 2010, and then he announced it at TechCrunch. And at first he thought it was going to be another one of these contrarian ideas that everybody says, oh, you're crazy. But it weirdly caught on. I mean, so many people seem to agree with him because of what he mentioned with the over $1 trillion of student debt. And he thought of college as sort of a 4-year vacation where you don't really learn that much if you're not motivated to do so. And so the first year he made this announcement that he was looking for 20 kids under age 20 to start new different companies out west and drop out. And 400 people applied. And it's still going on. And now 5,000 people apply every year.
What do they get?
They get $100,000. And then they get, now they get a lot more mentorship. And they have meetings every week or so with the leadership of the program.
Where can they live?
So they don't provide housing. So actually it's really hard. They have to find housing themselves. And they have to come up with an idea themselves, and they have to get it funded themselves. So the Thiel Foundation doesn't give them any money other than the $100,000, and I think it stretches over 2 years. So it's actually not that easy to do.
Do they have to live in Silicon Valley?
That's the preference. Some of them don't, but they don't have to. But they encourage them to live out there.
And where is Silicon Valley?
Oh, where is it? It's south of San Francisco. So it's sort of it would be it encompasses a pretty big area, but most of the fellows lived in Palo Alto and around Stanford.
It's San Jose out there, Palo Alto, exactly. San Mateo, those places. But what's located in there? How many of those companies did you come in contact with?
You mean of the fellows, or
no? Just as you went around, and what's all there?
Oh, so some of the biggest tech companies that I saw there. Facebook is there. Google Google's there, Apple's there.
Is
Twitter.
PayPal there?
PayPal, I think it is there. I should double check that, but because it's so funny, I barely even put PayPal in the book because Peter Thiel founded it so long ago, and then they sold it to eBay. But I mean, that's one of the things that seemed like such a simple idea that was so hard. And I think a lot of these kids look at these huge ideas. You take Twitter, you take Uber, Airbnb, and they seem like conversationally almost like a Seinfeld episode. Oh, if only we had this, then this could happen. And they felt like, oh, I could just do this like this. And it was so much harder. I mean, the work required was just was so surprising to me, because a lot of them felt like they were these. It felt like the rush of Hollywood actresses to LA, and they end up being a waitress and they wait for their big day. But I feel like it's harder to be Elon Musk than Tom Cruise. I mean, you have to be so many of these companies, Instagram, Uber, the people running them, didn't just have a lucky break. The stories were just years and years and years of coding and engineering. And I mean, they have qualifications that I can't even imagine. It just, when they're covered in the press, they've exploded. So I think it caused a lot of people to come out there just assuming that this would happen, and then they were disappointed.
Here is a group of the first fellows, which was in 2011.
Yeah, exactly.
I believe this was December. It's only 45 seconds.
Oh, cool. Okay.
My proposal is to cure aging.
I'm interested in keeping information accessible and free for people.
My current project is to build an open source electrospray mass spectrometer.
To make learning games for young children between the ages of 7 and 13.
Rotating a solar panel so that it can optimize the amount of electricity.
Advanced mobility aid that will allow disabled users to go essentially anywhere that an able-bodied human can.
Make it easier for everyday people who like music to go to more live events.
Bioethanol is the energy of the future for under 25 cents a gallon from waste products of cellulose.
Our goal is to make solar energy cheaper than coal without government subsidies.
My project is on an electric motor for electric vehicles.
I'm applying to pursue asteroid mining.
John Burnham, their last asteroid mining.
Yes.
How old was he when he started in all this?
Oh, he was 20, so he was pretty young.
You have to be under 20?
You have to be under 20. So when he applied, I guess he was 19.
What are the rules about college?
Oh, that you can't, you have to, you mean for the fellowship?
Yeah.
So you could stop out, you could go back after 2 years, but you had to drop out for those 2 years. One of them, this guy John Marbach, started Wake Forest for a year and then, for a semester, and then dropped out. But it cost him his teammates. His other team started without him, and he was left starting his own company. So ideally, they had to just completely drop out, and then 10% went back to college. So of each.
But some don't.
Yeah, a lot of them don't actually. So.
Do they start companies?
Yeah, they all started companies, or some of them worked for existing companies, but they all came up with an idea and tried to make it work. I mean, John Burnham, the company that he started, he actually didn't end up starting an asteroid mining company, but he started a company that would try to make online payments in gold, and you could do it on your mobile phone, and that didn't work out. So he ended up going back to Dartmouth, and he's still at Dartmouth. But a lot of them stayed out there. But
you say in your book that he went from asteroid mining to religion?
Yes. Oh, so he went. So he went. He had so many back and forths that his story was so interesting to me because the ups and downs were colossal. But he. So after that didn't work out, he went to Dartmouth, and then he came up with a new idea, and then he posted it on a blog. It was picked up, and it became so promising that he moved back to California. Then he became disenchanted with the life out there. So then he went to Thomas More, which is this really tiny religious school in New England. And he studied religion, and he became really into religion. And then now he's dropped out of that school, and he transferred to Dartmouth, back to Dartmouth.
So when did you start on this project? And this is your first book.
First book, yeah. I guess I started the reporting in 2010, and then over the next 2-3 years was out there pretty much half the time.
So how did you do it? I mean, how did you become a part of their lives?
Well, I guess I interviewed probably more than 100 people, and I knew, since I had known Peter Thiel and met some people who he worked with at the foundation who ran the fellowship, I just went to those final rounds and I started meeting the fellows, and was so interested in the idea of just education and what needs to be done about higher education, and that was such an interesting window because. Even just the parents' reactions were so interesting because when I was growing up, I'm 36, when I was growing up, if you didn't go to college, there was something wrong with you or you were having problems. Whereas now, the parents, at least of these kids, it was the first time I'd heard them be proud of their kids not going to college. And it was this other alternative to actually having to take this track. And I liked the idea of not having to go down that road. And you know, if I were applying now to college, maybe I would try to think of something different. I don't know if I would start a company in Palo Alto, but I feel like it did make me question other ideas instead of just having to do these 4 years of higher education.
So what was it like growing up in the Tom Wolfe home, and what was your mom like? Or I mean, she's still here, but what was what was her interest?
She used to be a graphic designer. I guess she still is, but she worked at Harper's Magazine for a long time. And my father, I'll only remember of him. I mean, I remember many things about him, but in terms of his work growing up, there was just he was on his typewriter all the time, so I heard the sound of the typewriter the entire time growing up. He still uses a typewriter, so my mother, I guess she's helped my father a lot with his books, and she reads all of his drafts, and she's read all of mine. So it's nice to have editorial parents.
Would you have been would you have been a writer if it hadn't have been for the family you grew up in? How big an impact did that have on you?
Oh, I think I don't think I would have been. I mean, I think I always liked English. I always liked writing, but I watched what it was so fascinating to me. I remember when I saw my father's personality, and then I read. He's so polite. You know, I've never heard him curse out loud. And then I read Bonfire of the Vanities, and I was like, Dad, you used the F word, and I couldn't believe that somebody of his comportment could get in the minds of all these other characters who were so different than him. And I thought that was so interesting, that you could be so different on the page than you are in person.
Well, and Charlotte Simmons is full of
oh my gosh, yeah. I mean,
language.
It really was. I know. I said, "How do you know about those things, Dad?" But yeah. So that was funny. And then I guess I interned at this freebie magazine out in Long Island, and I think because they were short-staffed, I wrote this restaurant review, and they just printed it as is. And I think I was reading The Agony and the Ecstasy about Michelangelo that summer for summer reading. So I started it saying, as in The Agony and the Ecstasy, Chef Michael Smith puts his pepperoni on his pizza. And I thought I was so amazing, and they published it as it was. So I had a falsely inflated view of my own writing expertise. And then they subsequently ran an actual review of the restaurant. But it helped working for these places that were understaffed and didn't edit you. But that was the first writing job at 15.
Where else have you worked before you got to the Wall Street Journal, and how long have you been there?
Oh, I worked at the New York Observer right out of college, which was so much fun because you could. I mean, I think if you had a good idea, they would hire a bum off the street if they had a good. There was no bureaucracy, and you felt like you were at the zeitgeist of New York. It was so fun.
And it ended up being owned by Jared Kushner.
Yeah, by Jared Kushner. I was there well before him, but then afterward, then I went to the Wall Street Journal, and then I went to Condé Nast Portfolio and wrote for Vanity Fair a little bit, and then on contract, not on staff, and then joined the Wall Street Journal 3 or 4 years ago. 4 years ago?
But years ago, you wrote about James Comey.
I did. Yes, I did. That's so true.
What were those circumstances?
Oh, that's so funny. So so that was around the time when Martha Stewart was being prosecuted, and it was that spate of white collar criminals, and he was in New York, the U.S. He was at the Southern District of New York, and So I did this profile of him, and then we didn't run it for a little while later, and so it was actually it ended up being weirdly timely. I'd love to profile him again, but I don't know if he'd be as available. But
are you surprised about what happened to him based on what he said in your interview?
He was pretty careful in my interview. I mean, he didn't really say anything. He didn't really give any new. He was pretty.
I've got it
well-liked.
here, and I was going to read back a quote in here that I thought might be interesting.
Yeah, sure.
Let's see if I can find it.
I'm impressed that you found this article.
Yeah, well, where is it? Quote, this criminal case, this is Martha Stewart, is about lying to the FBI, lying to the SEC, and lying to investors, he said at the June 4th press conference. This is back in 2003.
Yeah.
That is conduct that will not be tolerated.
Huh. Well, it's interesting thinking about that now. With the election, but
was he open to talking to you back then?
Was he? You mean at last
I mean,
fall?
when you interviewed? No. Back then, when was he? Could you interview him or?
Yeah, actually, I mean, I remember I met with his he had a press officer that I met with for hours before I met with him, because at the time I was 23, I think, and I really didn't know very much about law. I mean, I needed an education before I met with him. So I met with all these lawyers, and I talked to, I interviewed tons of people. I think it took 3 weeks to prepare for this because I was so new to it. And he was so friendly. Everybody I interviewed about him was so positive about him. And I guess I would never have expected the FBI, but back then it was a different time. But he was certainly getting a lot of attention for those white-collar criminals.
One of the women that is prominent in your book, a couple chapters on, Laura Deming.
Yeah.
Here she is.
Okay.
Sometimes I've talked to people and they say, well, if I lived to be 100 or 200, I'd get bored pretty quickly. I can't understand that. On my morning walks over to MIT, I love looking at things and just thinking about all the physics that goes into things like waves. or things like trees where there's cellulose on the outside of the cell. Life is mind-blowingly exciting. Sometimes we lose track of that. There's no better way to remember that than to think about what it would be like to die and not experience that. I want to cure aging. I want to make us all live forever.
How old is Laura Deming now?
22.
And
she's 21 or 22.
Did she go to MIT after she became a fellow?
No, she went at age 14. So yeah, she became she joined the UC Berkeley, a lab at UC Berkeley, and at 12, and then went to MIT at 14. And she's so fascinating to talk to because she finds biology and science so interesting, and she gets so excited about it. And I was so impressed by her, I have to say. She was so different than...
Why did she do the fellowship?
Well, I think because she already had been to college, and here was this network of people, including this guy named Dr. Aubrey de Grey, who has his whole research is based around ending the disease aging. So Peter Thiel had given him $3 million to look into anti-aging or curing the aging disease. And so he was one of her mentors. And there were a lot of people in the foundation and involved with the fellowship who were really interested in helping people live forever. And so she's really knowledgeable. She'd been working with worms, trying to help them live forever since she was 12. So it was a good fit.
Here's another person in your book, Paul Gu.
Oh yeah.
Let's watch.
There's this strange fascination, I think, especially in Silicon Valley, with people who have dropped out. And I think it's because of a logical fallacy that goes something like this. I've heard of a person called Mark Zuckerberg. I know he dropped out of college. I know he made a lot of money. I hear you dropped out of college. That must mean you're going to make a lot of money, like Mark Zuckerberg. And so, surprisingly, I've actually found that I think people tend to be more positively inclined towards listening to what I'm saying when I tell them that I've dropped out, which is kind of weird because that's not a reason to listen more to me.
What about Paul Gu?
Well, he was so interesting because he started this company called Upstart, and it gave people who didn't necessarily, it was a person-to-person lending company. So it did this similar thing as the fellowship in that if you didn't feel like you wanted to try to get a high-paying job at a bank or a consulting company and you wanted to be an artist, you could get a loan from another person, and there would be people who would fund you through this company. And but he had this algorithm to figure out the risk of funding a particular person, and it was so interesting because a lot of it was trying to I mentioned it in the book, but to quantify character. And so they had all these ways of deciding what somebody's character was, and they were all data points. And I thought it was such a weird thing that you could hack character. And I guess it was one of those examples out there of people trying to hack everything: morality, character, right and wrong. And he's a really disciplined guy. I think it was he just found it to be an interesting practice.
Can you describe the difference? Maybe this isn't fair, but you talk about your dad being so moral,
yeah.
Your parents. Can you describe the morality of your father versus the morality of these young kids that you write about out in Silicon Valley?
That's a really interesting question. Morality of my father versus these kids. Well, in a way, I kind of feel like they're similar in that my father, I wrote this story in high school called, and it was, you had to pick somebody who swims against the tide. And so my father, I wrote how he literally did. He always wore, he wore a two-piece bathing suit to the beach, and I'd be like, "Hello, Mr. Wolfe," and sort of wore a suit everywhere. And the ideas that some of the things he'll say, he just is so tickled by the fact that other people will find it crazy that he's saying this. And so, and I just think that's so brave. And so I think that...
Are you like that at all?
I would like to be. I'm probably less like that than my father, but it helps when you have more legs to stand on. I think after you've written a couple of best-selling books, and then people take you more seriously if you say crazy things. If you haven't, then they just look at you like you're crazy, probably. But maybe that's not across the board. But I guess a lot of the people in Silicon Valley were okay saying things that others might find immoral or not. I mean, my father definitely has a more traditional marriage than a lot of the people out there. And I think,
do they marry at all? I mean, you talk about polyamory.
Yeah, it's definitely not across the board, but I met people there who I wouldn't say that polyamory is immoral. It's transparent, at least, but just his ways of behaving are definitely different than theirs. And I guess what else would be different? The other thing is that while these people out in Silicon Valley are so different from each other, are so different from the East Coast, sometimes it feels like a uniform out there too. And I think my father is, almost morally opposed to any kind of uniform, that he does not want to have to fit into anything. And I think a lot of the behavior out there is, the hoodie, for example, is to fit in.
By the way, did you read Bonfire of the Vanities?
Yes.
How much of that came true?
A lot. That's true. Yeah, a lot. Very true.
And let's go to another one of your people that you write about, James Proud.
Oh, yeah.
Here's 45 seconds of James Proud.
Oh, great.
The inspiration basically came from a friend trying to find tickets to a concert, and it was pretty difficult, and there must be an easier way to do that. So I went away and thought about this for a week or so and thought, actually, there's actually something that could be built here. So I just built it as a side project and then released it one summer, and it got traction. And I thought, okay, I've been doing this for fun. I could take all this different data for live music stuff and do the same. So that started Gig Locator. So the most rewarding part of Gig Locator, and I guess sort of any startup, is actually seeing people use your product and hearing about people using something which you built and you don't even know the person.
What's the Gig Locator?
Oh, you can find a concert. It's an app that helps you find concerts wherever and whenever you want to go. And he's a huge success story out of he and Paul Gu were probably the biggest financial successes out of that first class. And now James Proud has this new Sense sleep tracker, and it's this little ball that's really nicely designed. And I think it was just named one of Time Magazine's 25 best innovations of the year last year.
What's it do?
It tracks the environment where you sleep, and so it can detect the air quality, and it can tell how you're sleeping. And so I think sports teams are starting to use it to help their athletes.
What does Peter Thiel think of his fellowship idea at this point? And he's been doing this now for about 5-6 years.
Yeah, well, I think I've talked to his foundation about this, and I think that they would say that it's been a huge success just because of the increase in applications from 400 to 5,000. And also the fellows, while they would say the goal wasn't necessarily for all of them to become billionaires, but just to sort of stop and think, oh, what else could I do? Do I have to go to college? Do I have to do something like that? And I kind of do think that it's become a model for just having for a gap year, or there's been a huge increase in that kind of those deviations away from just going to college since then.
How much of what you saw looks like what we're going to show now from HBO's Silicon Valley program that they do, this sitcom, but how much of it looks like this? Let's watch.
I think all of it, but anyway, I'll watch it.
I've already talked to Peter Gregory about insourcing a consultant. I've made contact with a programmer whose cloud architecture is supposed to be insane. They call him the Carver.
The Carver? That black cat guy who apparently hacked into the Bank of America and took down their entire system? That the Carver?
We should get him if we can.
Okay, we can talk to the guy, but I mean, he's really gonna have to sell me.
I think that's him. Excuse me, Mr. Carver?
Yeah, people refer to me as the Carver, but no one actually calls me that. It's what people call a screen name. You know, I'm Kevin.
Okay, Kevin.
I feel like it's so accurate.
What's an incubator?
Oh, it's basically kind of like a training center, and so it breeds companies. And
so what we saw there. I mean, in other words, big open space and lots of desks. And
and so you can the Y Combinator would be an example, and so you can apply to one of these incubators or some of them you don't have to apply to, but this one, but Y Combinator, for example, will help hatch an idea, and you'll have mentors and people helping you to come up with something that could be eventually worthwhile.
So, what did you start to realize about that whole crowd? And as a matter of fact, I also want to ask you what it was like leaving those. I mean, they're clearly bright people, but leaving that environment and going back to your other world.
Well, that's a good. I mean, so what I thought was so interesting about them was their personality, was the way they behaved was so different than the people that I knew on the East Coast, in that they would have this huge amount. So a lot of the people I talked to had a huge amount of knowledge in one particular area. And I have one chapter title called Asperger's Chic, which I mean as a compliment, because it's sort of this. I remember I was at a conference where Peter Thiel was asked if he thinks there's a spectrum, and he said not really. I mean, on the extreme cases, I'm sure he would, but he said it's sort of this term that people give, that smooth, slick people from the East Coast give to people they can't understand. And I think he wasn't completely serious then in that answer, but it is sort of an interesting. People there were so focused on their one idea that they were sort of awkward talking about other things in a way because they weren't that interested.
What about the business of they would hire somebody who stutters over somebody who doesn't, basically similar to what you're saying but in a different way? Is that really true?
I mean, it seems like it's they'd be skeptical toward people who were really smooth and were great at a cocktail party, because that's not really their job. Their job would be to code, or their job would be to come up with some new crazy idea. And so
what's this business about failing? It's a stroke of positive accomplishment if you fail.
Well, it's funny. Failing is the currency. So whereas on the East Coast, you'd say, oh, we know each other from Andover. There, oh, we know each other from failing at our first company. So it's sort of, they call pivoting completely and utterly failing. There are all these nice ways of saying fail. And it almost seems like it's a resume builder out there. But it seems now like it's a bit of a cliche how great it is to fail. But, I mean, I've failed many times, and I don't think it's that fun. But it sort of goes with the glorification of eating only ramen for breakfast, lunch, and dinner and living out of your car, which isn't actually that glamorous. When I would interview some of these people, they had tried that. And after a couple months, it's really not fun. So it does seem, though, in general, probably like a good thing to feel like you're not going to be cast out for failing. But
correct me if I'm wrong, but it appears to me there aren't many people of color in this business.
Yeah.
That they're Asians.
Yeah.
Didn't see many Hispanics, African Americans, and all. What did you find?
I found the same thing. And I actually, for my column at the Wall Street Journal, I interviewed this entrepreneur named Tristan Walker, and he'd come up with this bevel shaving system, and it was strange. Even though it was a razor, it was funded by a venture capital firm, and he calls it a tech company. But he has a foundation that helps support minorities and people, African Americans and underrepresented groups out there. And I asked him that question because I couldn't really figure it out, and his answer was that a lot of it starts with colleges, that a lot of colleges, you don't see as many African Americans in computer science classes, and also just more encouragement, just awareness that he was trying to help. He had a program during the summer where he would bring inner city kids and just African Americans in general out there to work and just let them know.
I'm going to show you a clip of Megyn Kelly, and this is somewhat out of context, but I picked this up because when reading your book, I kept wanting to ask you about the whole attitude about today's society. You grew up, you're 36, as you say, you grew up in the last 20 years and all that, and she's talking about the way she treats her children and about the idea that everybody gets a trophy. It's just brief. Let's watch it.
You're bringing up your kids with the same values of not everyone's a winner that your parents brought you up with, in this generation.
Oh, I've already thrown away my son's participation trophy. It went right in the garbage. I know, I'm sorry, I did. I went to my daughter's school. We had like the parent-teacher conference at the beginning, and she was like, what is your core message to Yardley? And I said, you are not special. And the teacher's like, what the hell?
Mom of the Year award.
Not special. I mean, you know, these are, excuse me, special people out there with, you can listen to them.
Right.
Do they feel special? And is that a good thing to tell each other we're special?
Well, in a way, a lot of people to have the confidence and the lack of awareness or the lack of humility to follow through with one of these big ideas, I kind of feel like it's not a bad thing to feel special. I mean, if you thought that you're average, then it's hard to come up with a crazy new idea like that. But it's funny, I had a book idea one time to write a book called American Coddle about how too many kids get how kids get too much positive reinforcement. And it kind of does lead to these huge expectations and then dramatic failures. And a lot of the kids actually experience that. I mean, it helped get them there, the feeling of being special, literally and figuratively, but because they were chosen for that. But once they got there and they didn't have this huge success, a couple of them felt really isolated and they really wanted to go back. And they were confused as to why this hadn't happened yet. One or two got really depressed. I mean, they're doing fine now. I think those two that I'm thinking of went back to college. So
were you coddled?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, but I wouldn't really have it any other way. I mean, I can't really complain.
What did your dad say about your book?
Oh, what did he say about the book?
Did he criticize it at all?
Well, he's very biased, so I think he liked it. But he was really helpful in that I had him read it, and he would say when he would always say put in dialogue whenever if a passage got really boring. He'd say create a scene, or you know, you really need to tell a story of what these people are like and what do they wear. He's always been really helpful in reminding me to write details. And then he has this tactic that he is way better at than I am about getting into a character's head. And when I read his books and he describes, oh, this person was thinking this, he wouldn't come out there and say that, but it's through the eyes of another character. It really sounds like that, whereas I'd have to keep going back and say, so did you think this at this exact moment? And the woman would say, I don't remember. And I'd say, well, do you remember what you did think? I was 3 years ago. You know, so my father's pretty conscientious in his note-taking. I think he really, I think he's so observant of every interview and scene he goes into. So that definitely helped to fill things out a little bit.
You can find our guest in the Wall Street Journal twice a week. This is her first book. She's a resident of New York City, and the name of the book is Valley of the Gods, a Silicon Valley story. Thank you, Alexandra Wolfe, very much.
Thank you very much.
Free transcripts, or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at Q&A.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.